That's what we got today. A history teacher. That's the best we could do. Oh, we're live? Oh, now. No. Hi. Welcome to Between Two Ferns. Without the ferns. Thank you, coronavirus. This is our special economics episode. I'm your host, Randy Hyatt. Today joining us is Mr. Alex Arwaldi. Arnaldi. He's a DP history teacher at the Odyssey Institute. So today what we want to talk about is the similarities and differences between the Great Depression in the United States and the Depression slightly before that in Germany. So Mr. Arwaldi, the similarities here are pretty vast, right? I mean, the Great Depression in the United States was caused because Wall Street sucks, and the climb out of the Depression in Germany was basically because they all disliked Jewish people, right?
A little racist, but I would say that the Great Depression, I think people misunderstanding that the Great Depression happens because of the stock market crash, but there's lots of things that happened prior to the stock market crash that lead to the depression. Same with Germany and their hyperinflation goods.
Right. So I have it on good authority that the only reason your students show up to your class is to see your huge calves.
Yeah, they see my calves and this really nice mustache, and because I'm the wrestling coach. It's better than judo.
Taekwondo?
Jiu-jitsu.
Jiu-jitsu.
Yeah.
Namaste.
You're of Japanese descent?
Chinese. Also half German. Crazy, I know.
Right. So when we're talking about recessions, it really comes down to the idea of different types of economic thought. And I know you're a history teacher, so that might be tough for you. But Hayek and the classical thought, it comes from Adam Smith, is the idea that the government shouldn't be involved. So how does that play into the idea of the Depression in both the United States and Germany?
Well, in the Depression, the government is going to get involved because everybody is out of work. We're looking at over almost 30% unemployment. So without anybody working, nobody's spending any money. When there's no money being spent, the economic wheels are not turning. In the government within the United States, we'll see FDR kind of put in some legislation. It's called the New Deal, and there's three parts to that New Deal, and he'll start putting, infrastructure together. It's the CCC is a good one. It's the Civilian Conservation Corps. He puts men that are from 20 to 30 to work, and they will be building roads and fixing bridges and getting paid and then sending that money back to their family. On the other hand, Germany is going to stop working but still pay the workers.
So you're more of a Keynesian economist? Is that what you're trying to tell me?
I would say yes. I would say as we pass through presidencies after FDR, we have Eisenhower, and he's going to build us or come up with the idea of the highway system. Adolf Hitler, we don't give him credit because he is a villain in the 20th century, but he does build the freeway where we go as fast as we want, and that's the Autobahn.
One last question, Mr. Arwaldi. Is that your real hair or are those plugs?
Well, the only thing that's definitely real is that individual societies is a history component, but underneath there is the one that's not so much that important, economics.
In the study of economics, macroeconomics is the big pimping of economics. While there's many who want to look at the differences between micro and macro is the entire economy, while micro is the individual facets of it. So when we're talking about macroeconomics, we're really studying what affects the economy as a whole, or aggregate supply and demand. So we're looking at the lack of growth, recessions, unemployment, and inflation, and their effects on the overall economy and how we fix it. This is different than micro because micro focuses on the smaller pieces of the economy, such as individual businesses or people or products. whereas macro looks at all of those. The evolution of macroeconomic theory has been something like a fight between two major groups, Keynesian economics and classical economists. Keynesian economics, which would be smaller but now starting to grow in popularity since the 1930s, upholds a much different idea than that of classical economists, those who strive for the much longer history of economists dating back to Adam Smith. Let's take a look at the major components or people inside these two economic ideas. The first of these is going to be classical theory. That can be championed in this by Friedrich Hayek. Friedrich Hayek and classical theorists are going to hold to the idea that economists believe that business cycles, ups and downs of the economy, are temporary glitches and who generally favor laissez-faire or non-activist policies as far as keeping the government out of the economy. Now, why that's general? Hayek, famous for his work in Austria, is going to say that in order to make liberty, we need to keep markets open. That it's not civil liberties or a constitution, but that we have open markets that allows us to have civil liberties. In saying this, Hayek and his followers are saying that the only way to run a proper economy is to do it through markets that are unfettered, and they will naturally balance themselves out. If the government becomes involved, then it's going to hamper the ability of the market to take care of itself, and nothing will come to its fruition. They are true believers in the visible hand will create an equal and balanced equilibrium point in the economy. They are bigger on what we'll talk about later, supply-side economics. The counterpoint to classical economists is going to be Keynesian economics, brought to us by John Maynard Keynes, or Lord John Maynard Keynes. Keynes is going to bring to us the idea of what would later turn into the father of deficit spending. Better it's said that Keynes promoted government intervention into the market. In order for the market to turn around in an equitable amount of time, the government would have to become involved with monetary and other policies to right the market. So instead of having an unfettered market, Keynes believed that having a little bit of deficit in order to reset the market through government spending was the only way to grow and make for a proper economy and to take care of the people inside of it. Again, let us remember that the key to this is reaching that 0% unemployment. Now, both of these ideas are trying to look in the idea of inflation. The problem is that neither of these ideas are looking at inflation the same way. While Keynesian economics makes a lot of sense and it's very intuitive, one thing that it forgets to take into account is the idea of inflation. Keynesian looked at it from a short-run perspective instead of a long run, and this is something that we'll get into a little bit later in this video. The idea, though, is that Keynes did not take into account the idea of relative pricing, that if everybody raises their price, then all that happens is prices raise and it has no effect on supply. This brings us to our two frameworks that we work in when we talk about macroeconomics. So Keynesian and classics both work in one of these frameworks, and you'll be able to connect the two. So what we're looking at is the long run versus the short run. So when we talk about these, what we want to understand is what they both entail. When we're talking about long run, what we're talking about is supply side economics. What it's looking at, if we're talking about long run policies, is policies that affect the production of supply, such as incentives to promote work, capital accumulation means factors of production, and technology change. All these are key in the long run. Long run has to do with anything that doesn't have fixed variables, meaning we can change any of the variables and look at what the process of our supply chain is going to be in a longer term. Now, the problem with both long run and short run economics is that it doesn't have a time variant. The key difference is the idea between fixed variables and unfixed variables. For example, a fixed variable is whether I can get rid of my factory or not and upgrade it. In the short run, we have fixed variables, things we can't change. In the long run, we have variables that are all changeable. On the other side, when we look at short run is more what we call demand side economics. Most of the policy discussion of short run business cycles focus on the way to increase or decrease aggregate expenditures, such as policies to get consumers and businesses to increase their spending. In this case, what we're talking about is increasing demand. So the short run is looking at increasing aggregate demand or slowing it down. And in the long run, we're looking at increasing or slowing down the idea of aggregate supply. Two different approaches to it. As you can see, the idea from the classical economist has to do with dealing with aggregate supply, meaning that they're more attached to the long run issues. Whereas on the other side with Keynesian economists, they're more attached to the demand side, looking how to increase or decrease demand. Another very superficial way of looking at this is if you're looking at the political entities that support these, the long run is going to be more supported by those who are in the Republican or conservative facets, and then the short run is going to be more of the liberal and Democrat facets, as they're going to look for more government spending and the increase of the households and demanders rather than the suppliers.
And just like that, my running days was over. So I went home to Alabama.
Now let's take a moment to revolve back to the idea of classical versus Keynesian economics. The 1930 Great Depression brought about Keynesian economics to the forefront, the idea that the government was going to have to spend money in order to right the economy in slowed times. Now, in that, Keynesian economics started to move to the forefront. However, in the 1970s, we ran into a depression in the United States. During this mini recession, Keynesian economic policies didn't work. This started to bring back the classical forefront, that Keynes was not right in his assumption. In 2008, during the Great Recession, we also saw the knockout of Keynesian economics, as government spending was not righting the market. And instead, what we had is what we call structural stagnation. Structural stagnation is a period of protracted slow growth and high unemployment, meaning that we're pouring money into the economy, but it's not growing very fast, and unemployment stays at a very high rate. This happened through the 2008 recession and our slow growth afterwards, which meant that the Keynesian economics weren't working right either. This opened up the idea that we needed to look at other ways to stimulate the economy. This caused the merging of classical and Keynesian economics to a more moderate approach, that there were ideas in both that needed to be looked at, that not at all times was government spending the best idea, but sometimes it was needed. Let us return to the idea then, is that we suffer from this idea of structural stagnation and tying the idea of business cycles, which is something that we pull from the short-run economic piece, to imply it to the long run. So even if the economy is on a steady long-run growth path, there are inevitably fluctuations around that trend. The phenomenon has given rise to the term business cycles. A business cycle is a short-run, temporary upward or downward movement of economic activity, or real GDP, that occurs around the growth trend. What that really means is that at any given point in the economy in the short run, we're in a certain business cycle. So what are the business cycles? Well, the business cycle breaks down into three general areas. One, expansion. A turn up that lasts at least 2 consecutive quarters of a year. So we could be in a period of expansion, okay? And that's when we're going to see that inflation. Or we could be in recession. It's generally considered to be a decline in real output that persists for more than 2 consecutive quarters a year, okay? And that's usually during our deflation times. Now, if either of those becomes too bad, we are either in inflation, which can turn into stagflation, or we are in such deep deflation that we fall into recession. Okay, so those are the general pieces of the business cycle. What we want to do is we want to have this steadied increase of inflation, about 2 to 4% per year, that has steady growth. But ultimately, the idea is to keep unemployment at that 0% rate, or 4 to 6%. Now, how we do that is dependent on which structure we believe in. Do we believe in the short-run structure, where we attack demand, or do we believe in the long-run structure, where we attack supply? Now, there's more to these concepts that we can move through, but at this point, what we want to understand is the general concepts that are at play. So if we understand generally how long-run is attacking demand, and that short run is attacking demand and long run is attacking supply, that's enough for what we're looking at in these times. Now, if we sit down in an intro class into college, we're going to look at aggregate demand and supply, and we're going to look at graphing them and the effects of them. But really, the effects on them aren't any different than they were in micro. The same things that affect demand in microeconomics are the things that affected in aggregate demand in macro, and the same for supply. It's just on a bigger level. We just want to use those in a bigger amplification. The final thing that we talk about is unemployment, and we've already covered that in this unit. But unemployment now becomes a government problem as we're looking at the government becoming involved in how to solve these issues. This comes to the key crux of what we're talking about inside this unit. When we look at GDP, inflation rates, unemployment, and all of the other things that we've put together, those are the keys to how we deal with it. But the question still stands. Whose responsibility is it to deal with the economy? Is it more of the classical sense that we should leave it unfettered and it will figure itself out? Or is it more of the Keynesian effect that the government needs to take more responsibility and increase its spending? But even if we take the Keynesian effect in a more moderate approach, where do we spend that money? Is it on the demand side, or is it on the supply side? Or is it somewhere in between? Or is it neither at all? These are questions that we need to pose ourselves and start to ask in these political times. What is it that the government is supposed to do? How are they supposed to use fiscal and monetary policy, and what laws can they enact, or what tax breaks and subsidies can they enact, or price control measures can they enact to help the American people out? And who is it that we are supposed to be helping out? These are all things that we want to look at and try to come to in decisions by ourselves. That is going to be the subject matter of our final. Hopefully this has helped out a little bit of bringing some of these policies together and understanding of where we stand. So the question is, where do you stand? Are you more of a classical economist? Are you more of a Keynesian economist? I'm sure that most of us stand somewhere in between, but it's to a matter of what extent. Where do we believe that policy decisions by government should be, and how much power should we be giving to the government in order to do that? I thank you for your time, and I look forward to talking to you later this week.